Hi everyone, I'm Pastor Tim, lead pastor at Grace Bible Church in Menifee, California. And we're not just streaming a Bible study tonight, we've created this format just for this kind of live study. We started last Tuesday night introducing the book of Hebrews by showing the ways the themes in Hebrews fit together really well with our current study in the book of Acts on Sunday mornings. So tonight we start into Hebrews chapter 1, and the first 4 verses of Hebrews 1 are kind of like the view from the top of the highest peak. And I'll come back in a little while and explain that illustration more. While we wait for others to join us, let's go ahead and get our text up here on the screen so that we can get started thinking about it. And I'm going to put this up here in 2 versions, the ESV and the New English Translation, or the Net Bible. And I'm going to put down here at the bottom a couple questions, because one of the first things we want to do with any Bible study, any passage, is we want to ask, what would I like to know about these verses? Just what are the questions that come to mind when you look at them? And also here, since we have 2 translations side by side, we want to ask, what differences do you notice? What differences do I notice between the 2 translations? So while we wait for other people to join in, you could jump into the Facebook comments section and answer either one of those 2 questions. What would I like to know about these verses? Or what differences do I notice between the 2 translations? So let's read the verses together. Hebrews 1 and 2 in the ESV. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son. Okay, so I'm going to give you just a little bit here to look at those and comment. We'll give you about 30 seconds here, and then we'll make some announcements and get into our study. All right, let's read it one more time. You can put in any comments you have about what you'd like to know about these verses or what differences you notice between the translations. Hebrews 1 and 2. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son. Okay, couple of introductory things as we're getting started. This is the second of a 4-week trial run of these midweek studies. We do want to see how the day and the time work for you, and at the same time we're learning all of our gear and equipment and getting things figured out here, so appreciate your patience with us. But it's also a chance for us to really refine what we're doing and get ready to do this on an ongoing basis down the road. So just a reminder that we have 2 more weeks of this coming up, Tuesdays, May 22nd and 29th, but then we also have a live online seminar this Sunday at 6 that I'll tell you about later on. Remember to like, share, comment, click that follow button. All those things help spread the word for us. And a couple new things. If you missed last week's study, the archive is up now on our website. So let me show you a couple pages. Here's our GBC Live archives. You can get to that from the bottom of findhope.net/live or with that address at the top of the screen here. That has all of our live archives on it. And then there's another page that's findhope.net/Hebrews, and that will have all the archives from the Hebrews study. So you can go back, catch any that you missed. And remember, you can always go back and share an archived video also to refresh it for others to see. Again, keep in mind that people who don't have Facebook can watch this stream at findhope.net/live. And you can comment or ask questions. If you're not on Facebook to use those comments, you can use the phone number 951-809-3194 and text us there. Now, if our stream drops like it did last week, then just keep checking Facebook. Last week it took us about 3 minutes and we were back up and going. You might have to close your app or log out. Some people had trouble seeing the new stream until they did that, but we should be able to get back up on Facebook right away. And if Facebook goes completely down, and the reason why I'm saying that now is because Facebook Live had some big problems on Sunday and lots of people weren't able to stream. If Facebook dies completely, then go over to the church YouTube page and we'll try to get the live stream up there. YouTube, you can see the address there. We'll get the URL up here on the screen, hopefully in just a second, for YouTube. There it comes. Or you can just search for Grace of Menifee in YouTube and find it. So we'll try to live stream there if Facebook fails on us completely, and we'll put that YouTube link in the Facebook comments. All right, enough preliminaries. So as we finish up those things, what I want to do now is just encourage you to focus on God's Word. It is tempting when you're watching something like this to multitask. And now I know some of you are trying to keep an eye on children, and so you have to multitask to keep your kids alive. So that's different. But for those of you who don't have that kind of a responsibility, I just encourage you to really focus on God's Word. Part of the essential message of Hebrews is pay closer attention. And so I encourage you to take some good notes along the way, have your Bible open to help you focus. So I said earlier that the opening verses of Hebrews are like the view from the top of the highest peak. So let me start into that, start getting ready to explain that more. But first, let's read them. So if we just go over here to our Bible, Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 4. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. All right, that's the prologue to the book of Hebrews. And when you read Christian literature about Hebrews, whether it's all the way back to our earliest Christian literature from the first centuries of the church or up to the very latest commentaries on Hebrews, like the one by Tom Schreiner, many of them, speak of Hebrews in very lofty language. I could have copied in tonight many paragraphs that describe the book with words like majestic and beautiful and powerful. And one of the reasons why it receives so much praise is because it's unique in its message in the New Testament. Not unique in a way that makes it contradictory, but it really fits into a very unique slot that then fits together with everything else in a really remarkable way. And so writers often comment on what a gaping hole there would be in our New Testament if we didn't have this book. Another reason for the praise is because of the literary quality of it. It has the finer literary Greek than any other book. And Schreiner says the reader sees a master craftsman at work. So in Hebrews, the literary quality is very, very high. For example, in verse 1, there are 5 words in Greek that begin with the letter P, or the P sound. And that can hardly be accidental. It's the mark of a very high literary quality. Now, that might make us think that the author was very skilled, and that's probably true. But what I want to make sure we see is that it means the author worked hard. He was very patient. He worked very carefully because he was so passionate about what he was writing. He wasn't trying to get a grade for a course or something. He was trying to communicate God's truth. And so he's not trying to impress literary critics. He's passionate and personal in his appeals and in his challenges and in his encouragements. And so the book was carefully crafted out of love for God and love for God's people. It makes me think of just this past Sunday. And, you know, as a Bible teacher, you wish you could always put in as much work as you wanted into your teaching and preaching, but you don't get to. But sometimes there's something that is really important to you and you really, really kind of pour your heart into. And that's the way this last Sunday's Mother's Day sermon was for me. I just so much wanted to encourage the ladies in our church with that. And I get that same feel in Hebrews, like this author just very much poured his heart into what he wrote. So it receives high praise because of its unique place in the New Testament, because of its very high literary quality, its beauty, but then thirdly, because it's such a profound book theologically. It's often said that together with Romans and Galatians, these are the great theological books in the New Testament. So unique in its message, yet a powerful complement to the rest of the New Testament, beautiful in its literary quality, profound in its theology. And when I say all that, might make it sound like it's distant and unrelated to us. But at the same time, if we go to our slides here, they were being seduced by teachers of false doctrine, they being the readers of Hebrews. And they were in danger of forgetting the true word that their first leaders, now dead, had taught them. The tragic thing about these believers is that they were at a standstill spiritually and in danger of going backward. Some of them had even forsaken the regular worship services and were not making spiritual progress. So from that, we can see that it is not a theology textbook. It's not an author showing off his literary prowess. It's Jesus for struggling Christians. It's a passionate plea to those who are drifting or doubting or running out of strength or dull or even defying the word. It's a passionate personal plea. The author even tells us that if we look over at Hebrews 13, I think we mentioned this verse last week, but Hebrews 13:22, I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation. Well, he's not viewing it as some literary essay. This is a word of exhortation, a word of encouragement. Roy Hession writes this: it is then a very urgent writing for those tempted to draw back. But for those who see themselves as poor and needy, it is a supremely encouraging one. For here we see Jesus as the sinner's friend and high priest. So it's not an exaggeration to say that you could fill a book with the praise that Hebrews has received across the centuries. Yet it's not a book that intends to show off. It's a passionate, personal plea born out of love for God and others. Now that brings me finally to my opening illustration. If Hebrews is like the highest of the mountains in the New Testament, which is what many authors say, and of course when we say that, we're not diminishing any of the other New Testament books. We're just trying to point out what a wonderful book Hebrews is. If Hebrews is like the highest of the mountains in the New Testament, then Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 4, is like the peak of that mountain. Let me just show you some things people have said about the prologue at the beginning of Hebrews. The opening paragraph of Hebrews may be the stylistic apex of the entire Greek New Testament. These verses provide one of the most arresting beginnings possible, combining elegance, alliteration, rhythm, rhetorical artistry, and unstoppable force, with probably the most sophisticated and stylish Greek in the entire New Testament. The doctrinal sweep of these verses is breathtaking, making a major contribution to our understanding of the biblical doctrines of revelation, Christology, soteriology, creation, and eschatology. The majestic Christology places this paragraph alongside John 1, Philippians 2, Colossians 1 as one of the four key Christological passages in the New Testament. Scarcely a major theological category is passed over in this panoramic paragraph. Virtually every single word is pregnant with meaning. It must be regarded as one of the most pregnant and noble passages of Scripture. And finally, Leon Morris, it is a majestic introduction, a single, powerful sentence. So let's look again at that single, powerful sentence as a whole, back to Hebrews 1, and let's read it again. long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. So let me show you a couple of things in the text here. First of all, when you look at the text first, it looks like the subject and verb are God spoke. But actually, that's a participle that is subordinate to the main verb. The main verb is over here in verse 2, God has spoken. And so actually, what we've got here is kind of like a parenthesis. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But the main subject and verb is God has spoken, what God has done today. God has spoken, and we'll talk in a little bit about this. God has spoken by his Son. The Son is the centerpiece of the passage. And what comes after that is 7 affirmations of Christ's superiority. Let's mark them here in the text. He's appointed heir of all things. The world was created through him. He's the radiance of the glory of God, number 3. He's the exact imprint of God's nature, number 4. He upholds the universe by the word of his power, number 6. He made purification for sins, number 7. And that phrase that fits so well with Acts, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. 7 affirmations of Christ's superiority. Now, we're not going to study those tonight, but let me just show you that in list form. Those 7 things, and you don't really need to write these down now because these are for a later week study, but his ultimate inheritance, his creative role, his full deity, his sustaining power, his purifying work, his exalted position, his superior name. So we'll study those in the weeks ahead, but 7 affirmations of Christ's superiority. And the thing to notice for now is that those aren't just doctrinal theory. They directly or indirectly show Christ's claim on each of us. And they show what a treasure Christ can be for each of us. So we'll study them later, but for now we're going to focus on verse 1 and the beginning of verse 2. All right, let me stop here and take a look to see if we have any comments here or questions. We'll compare the verses in a little bit. Looks like hopefully audio is working and no other questions. So, okay, let's go on into verse 1. Let's see. Sorry, I don't need that. So, verse 1, if we look back at our Bible software, guys, if you can go to the Bible for just a second. Hebrews 1:1 begins with the words, long ago. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke. Okay, so the phrase long ago, is this talking about something that's a long time before the author of Hebrews was writing? Or is this talking about, does it just mean in the past? Just sometime before the author of Hebrews was writing. And if we look up the word, if we switch back to the Bible, it doesn't actually answer the question for us. Here's the word, denoting past time in contrast to the present, pertaining to a point of time in the past, long ago, or formerly. So the word can mean either one. We're going to need the context to show us what the meaning is. So let's just think about the two options. If the idea is long ago God spoke, then the point could be God's revelation to Israel had dried up for several centuries. If Malachi was the last of the prophets, that was 4 centuries earlier. And there was a general belief among the Jews that prophecy had died out a long time ago. So in that case, the idea here would be God hasn't been speaking for a long time, but now he has spoken. Now, the other way to take it is with the idea of formerly, just before this. And if that's the idea, then the point is just before this, God spoke in these ways. But now there's been a change. That was the former age. This is the new age. Now God is going to speak in a new way. So if we go back and look at the verse again, what is the phrase in verse 2 that goes together with long ago in verse 1? Long ago, at many times in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days. So what we're going to do is start to put together a chart here. Verse 1, we have long ago, and now the comparison in verse 2 is the phrase, in these last days. Formerly, God spoke to Israel a long time ago because God seemed to have stopped speaking for centuries, but now, in these last days, God has spoken. And we're not really going to talk about it tonight, but we can also add this. God spoke to the fathers, which is just referring probably to the Jewish people in that sense. But now, today, he has spoken to us, Jewish Christians and everybody else in the audience of Hebrews. Okay, can we go back to the Bible for just a minute? Back to verse 1. Long ago, at many times, and in many ways. Now, this is one of the places where you might have noticed, if we go back to our slides, you might have noticed a difference in translations. The ESV says at many times, and the Net Bible says in various portions. And then the next phrase is pretty much the same. In many ways in the ESV, in various ways in the Net. But you've got a difference there in that first phrase. So I know the first phrase is bold there on your slide, but ignore that for a minute. And we're going to talk about the second phrase for just a moment. God spoke in many ways. Now, is that true? Think back to the Old Testament. You have visions, you have dreams, you have direct communication, you have in writing, like on Mount Sinai, on the Ten Commandments, or think about the variety of Old Testament scriptures. You have stories, hymns, proverbs, parables, love songs, apocalypse, and more. So God truly did speak in many ways. Okay, but then what about that first phrase? Is it at many times, or is it in various portions? Of course, both things are true, and the word could mean either, but let's go look up the word again. If we just go to our Greek lexicon, polumeros means, right here, in various parts. Now, that could mean various parts of time, so it could mean at many times, but the primary idea is various parts. So what does that contrast with in verse 2? If we maybe look back at our comparison chart. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So what it contrasts with is by his Son. Now, we'll talk about that phrase more in a little bit, but for now, we're talking about the how it contrasts. If we go to our chart, that'll help us, I think. In different portions and in different ways is in comparison to now he has spoken by his Son. So I want us to think about that, the comparison between in different portions and in different ways, and now by his Son. So a couple things. First of all, if you read the old commentators on this passage, they talk about how God gradually unveiled the plan of redemption in the Old Testament. In early Genesis, you have clues. With Abraham, you learn more. The law of Moses gives pictures and types. Through the Psalms, you learn more. The prophets give some specifics, etc. So they would say God formally revealed redemption one piece at a time. Now he has revealed redemption completely in one piece in Jesus. So that's one way to think about it. Secondly, we could remember that God's revelation in the Old Testament did come in many parts. There wasn't any place in the Old Testament where it was all together. And so it's kind of intriguing to ask, how many of the parts did most people have in ancient Israel? Many people only had a few of the parts. They just had the law of Moses, or they just had the works of one prophet. They just had parts of the revelation of God. And even the prophets themselves, how many parts did they have? Maybe they had some parts of the law. Maybe they had some of Israel's history, the Psalms. Maybe they had their own prophecies. Did they have anybody else's? Don't know. So everybody just had pieces, and there's no place in the Old Testament that gives you all the parts. And so can you see how when you have that idea, then you think of Jesus, and it's like, whew, now we have the full revelation of God in one place, in Jesus Christ, in one person. In the Old Covenant, there were always other revelations or more revelations or later revelations coming, but now it's all found in Christ. Instead of many parts, many ways, one full revelation of God. So that takes us back to our chart there again, and we can see in different portions and in different ways compares now to how he was revealed himself by his Son. All right, I'm keeping an eye on Facebook comments here, so if you have any questions along the way, feel free to jump in with those, and I'll try to catch them. But let's go now to look at this about the Son. And we're going to just add it to our chart here. No, we're going to go to our comparison. In these last days, he has spoken to us. Okay, here's where you probably noticed a difference between translations, right? By his Son in the ESV, in a Son in the New English translation. Now, there are other things in these verses we could talk about. We'll come back and talk about some of it next week. But for now, I really want to focus on this part about the Son. So let's just go ahead and fill out the rest of our chart. Long ago, in comparison to in these last days, God spoke to the fathers in comparison to he has spoken to us. And then there are two things that relate to he spoke by his Son. By the prophets is now by his Son. In different portions and in different ways is now by his Son. So if we go back to the Bible, Hebrews 1, and look at where this phrase is. Here's by his Son right here in verse 2. And this is the centerpiece of verses 1 through 4. In other words, all of this leads up to it. All of this points back to it. All 7 of these points down here point back to that. And the part about God speaking long ago leads up to him speaking in the Son. So these verses are saying, before God spoke in many portions and ways by the prophets, but now the full and final revelation has come in Jesus, who is great in these 7 ways. So if we go back to my illustration from the beginning, if Hebrews is one of the highest mountains in the New Testament, and if Hebrews 1 through 4 is like the peak of that mountain, then the word Son is like the stone at the top of the peak, the very top of the peak of this mountain in the New Testament. God has spoken by his Son. Okay, but is it by his Son, like the ESV, or in a Son, like the New English translation? And the problem here is that there's just no simple English way to translate the meaning in the original. So let's talk about 2 parts of it. First, we'll talk about his Son versus a Son, and then we'll talk about the word by versus the word in. And that probably sounds technical or something, but all these things matter in terms of what we learn about Jesus, and I'll try to show you that. Okay, so should it be his Son or a Son? It's obviously God's Son. So the word his is implied in the passage, and Bible translations often include words that are clearly implied. So some translations include the word his here. But there actually isn't a Greek word there to translate his. It's just implied. The Greek text just says a son. But when you translate it a son in English, that sounds like God has lots of sons, and Jesus is just one of them. He's just one of many sons. And that's not at all what the Greek means. What the phrase is indicating is that God has now spoken in a greater way than through the prophets. Before, he spoke in a prophet kind of way. Now, he has spoken in a son kind of way. Here's the way Alan explains it, if we go to our slides. If you translate it in a son, it's a little hard because that suggests he's just one of many sons, when the Bible teaches he's the unique Son of God. If you translate it in his Son, that kind of distracts from the point, which is that it's not a prophet, it's a son that God has revealed through now. If you translate it with the phrase in Son, that's good, accurate. That's accurate, but it's lousy English. Or if you translate it in one who is by his very character and nature a son, which would be best, it's way too long to put into your English translation. So the translators end up just a little bit stuck. But the point is that the climactic revelation has come not through prophets, but through a family member, through a son. I think there's a Bible passage that'll help us think that through. It's in Luke chapter 20. So let's turn over there, or whatever we're virtually doing in our software here. Luke 20. Jesus began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent a third. This one also they wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." That passage really captures what Hebrews is talking about when it says, now God has spoken in a son. Now it's not just a servant who's been sent, not just a prophet. Now it's a son. Actually, it's the unique Son, the one and only Son of God in Jesus Christ. So that's why on our chart, if we look at our chart again, you see that by his Son, or in a son, is the answer to both by the prophets and in different portions and in different ways. Instead of different portions and ways, now there's one answer in the Son. And instead of prophets, now it's a family member. Now it's a son. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Now, should it be by his Son or in a son? Should it be by or should it be in? Now, maybe that sounds too picky to matter, but here's why it matters. The Greek most literally says in a son, though it could mean by his Son. So what's the difference? By his Son could sound like the Son just brought a message. You can strap a message to your dog and say you sent the message by the dog. The dog's just the carrier of the message. He doesn't communicate anything about it. And that's the problem. Jesus was more than just the carrier of the message. He was the message. We beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus brought the message, but he was the message also. His whole life, his character, his death, his resurrection, and his words all brought God's message. So I think it's helpful to think of the phrase in a son, not just a message that Jesus carried, but a message that Jesus was. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. God spoke in a son. All right, so let's look back now. We've gone through a lot of things there quickly. Let's look back. Hebrews 1:1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. Okay, is that making sense now? Let's just talk through each of the phrases. Let's just leave the Bible up there. Long ago, so that means either it's been a long time since God spoke, which is true, or in the past age, he spoke. Long ago, at many times and in many ways. So there were many fragments, many portions, and many different ways in which God spoke. And he spoke to our fathers, to the Jewish people, and he did it by the prophets. But, and that word, we'll come back and talk about it again next week, but that word isn't like a big contrast. Rather, there's continuity, because how God spoke before flows into how he's speaking now. But in these last days, he has spoken to us in a Son, or by his Son. In these last days, he has spoken to us in the person of the one and only Son of God. One final revelation of God that brings it all together. Now, what does that mean? What is it that we're supposed to conclude from that? And I'll come back and I'm going to touch on some more of those things next week. But for now, if you've got a Bible, go to Hebrews 2, or we'll get it up here on the screen. Hebrews 2, verse 1. So here's the connection. Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. Pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. So now you can see why at the beginning I encouraged us to focus, to not multitask our relationship with Jesus. If we don't pay very close attention, we will tend to drift away. I think we probably think of drifting away as something that's very intentional. But I think drifting away is something that happens quite naturally when we don't pay close attention. And we can't drift away from the great once-for-all revelation of who God is and what God has done for us. So if we look at our slides one more time, I think I have these two phrases put together. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. All right, let me stop and see. If you have questions about that, now's the time to jump in before we finish up here for tonight. So a couple of you have mentioned the capitalization. So let me talk about that for just a minute. And while I do that, if anybody else has questions you'd like to ask, jump in and put them in now so that we can get those answered before we finish up here. Okay, so if we go back to our slides for just a minute, back to our translation comparison, the ESV capitalizes the word Son and the Net Bible doesn't. So what does that mean? The Greek text doesn't capitalize words like that for us. So when you're reading the Greek New Testament, you can't look at a word like Son and know whether it's talking about God or not based on its capitalization. So we do that in English, but that's not done in the Greek New Testament. So what that means is that English Bibles do decide to do it. They do decide to use capital letters. But when they do that, that's not translating necessarily. We might call that a little bit more like interpreting. They're saying, we think this word is referring to God, and so we're going to capitalize it. So there's argument about whether or not translation should do that, because sometimes there are places where a translation translates, capitalizes a word, and you might study that passage and say, I don't think they got that right. I don't think that is referring to God in that place. So my preference is just that they not try to use capitals in those places, but many translations do that. Okay, let's see. We've got a question on text. Why is it not translated in his Son? Okay, so I would like the translation is. I would like the translation is. You know what? Let's pull up a translation comparison here real quickly, guys. If we go to our Bible software, Hebrews 1 verse 2, and let's see what we have. All right, so here we go. The New American Standard translates it in his Son. The Net Bible in a Son, as we've seen. The ESV by his Son. NIV by his Son. KJV by his Son. New King James. Down here is the Christian Standard Bible, which also has by his son. So lots of translations with by his son. The net has in a son, and the NASB in his son. So you're asking about the NASB phrase in his son. And my personal preference is I like the word in. I think I prefer that to by. But then they're adding the implied word his. So the net's actually a little bit more direct to the text when it says in a son. But they're saying, hey, in the context, it's clearly God's son. So we're going to put in the word his. But I don't prefer that because I don't want you to miss the point that it's a son as opposed to prophets. It's a family member through whom God is communicating. So those are hard translation decisions. I'm not trying to criticize any translation. I'm just trying to point out to you the decisions that the translators have to make and the ways the different translations can help us understand the text. All right, let's see. Is the same Greek preposition used for by the prophets and by his son? Yeah, and the answer is yes. We'll go back and double check that just to make sure. Hebrews 1:1. God spoke to our fathers by, so there's N right there. In these last days he has spoken to us by, so there's N right there, by his son. So that's actually one of the arguments some people would use for why it should be translated by. But I would say at the same time that God did speak through the prophets, through their lives. Think of someone like Hosea. Think of the people like Ezekiel and Isaiah and the living illustrations God had them do, the acted out prophecies. So I think God spoke in the prophets too, just like he did through Jesus. But yeah, same word used in both places. Okay, any more questions before we finish up for tonight? 7:42, so we're right on time. Okay, great. We'll be back next week, and I know there are some things that we didn't talk about there, like the phrase in these last days. So I'll clean up a couple of those things next week, and then we'll flow right into what those 7 phrases about Jesus in the end of verse 2 and then into verses 3 and 4. So those are going to be fun to study together. Let me remind you before you go that we have this Sunday evening a live seminar. Oops, I got out of place. There we go. This Sunday evening, 6 o'clock p.m., we've got a live seminar on anger, transforming anger. That'll be from 6 to 7:30 this Sunday. So, Facebook users, if you haven't yet shared that, once you finished with this stream, go find it on our church Facebook page and make sure you share that event for Sunday evening's live stream. 6 o'clock p.m. Sunday evening, Transforming Anger from 6 to 7:30. All right, I don't see any other questions, so that's all for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us.